Hello and welcome. This is the final Business Roundtable update for 2021. I'm Grant Walker and joined by Business New Zealand CEO Kirk Hope. Well, the year is almost over. What a year. Has business really survived, or how well has it survived?
Well, I think it's been different for different sectors. You know, the export sector has clearly held up pretty well. It does face challenges in respect of labour shortages, which will be problematic for 2022. But there are clearly sectors that are under incredible amounts of pressure in the tourism and hospitality and the retail parts that are related to those sectors. So they've done it and continue to do it pretty hard. And for tourism, they will do until we can get the borders open. International education is another area where the market has been severely impacted.
All right, in terms of support for businesses, did they get what was needed, or do you think that looking forward they're going to need more?
I think there's no doubt that if international borders remain closed due to Omicron, they are going to need, particularly in the tourism sector, they're going to need additional support. I mean, I think the bottom line there is retaining enough of the industry to be able to service international guests once they are able to come back to New Zealand, whenever that is.
All right, if you compare, say, 2021 to 2020, what were the lessons we learned, do you think, from the original lockdowns? And did we learn anything?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the observations that I make was that businesses became much more agile about how they were able to operate under lockdown scenarios, and that was probably a key learning from the 2020 lockdowns. I mean, I do think for 2022, the traffic light system means the prospect of less widespread lockdowns, you would hope. So that's a really important change. But as I say, I think businesses learned a lot about agility and how to continue to meet their demand when they were in lockdown scenarios.
All right, let's look ahead to 2022. Now, you mentioned just tourism there. So what are the other big challenges from your point of view? And there's one big one that's looming on the horizon, I presume, which is fair pay agreements.
Well, I think in general, the question of rising costs for businesses, whether it's coming out of logistics and their supply chains, whether it's coming from an extremely tight labour market looking to get tighter, or whether it's just other factors that are related to costs of production, including rising interest rates, so their cost of capital will be going up. So I think that those are the really big challenges. I mean, on the upside, demand in a range of sectors remains pretty strong, and I think we've seen that through the Crown accounts continuing to be strong, the tax take continuing to be strong. Again, that's a reflection of how well businesses have adapted and adjusted to the circumstances. And I think that's probably what you're seeing globally a bit as well. Businesses have figured out how to operate in a pandemic environment and can do so pretty safely now.
Are they false figures in this way, that the figures look good, but because some sectors are so good, everyone has the impression that everyone's doing okay, when in fact they aren't?
Well, undoubtedly. I mean, look, macroeconomic. When you look at macroeconomic data, it is exactly that, macroeconomic data, and it will shade what is some pretty dire situations in some of those sectors. I mean, I guess the key thing from a government perspective is that they're looking at that tax take, saying, okay, well, if we need to continue to support businesses, if we have to in the situation of Omicron, even under the traffic light system, then they have the capacity and capability to do so without necessarily having to put on more debt.
All right, let's talk about those fair pay agreements. Where are you ending the year at?
Well, we advised the government that we were choosing not to be a default bargaining agent, so that we're not going to take the $250,000 a year.
Although the minister just sort of went, oh yeah, whatever, we're carrying on.
Yeah, sure, and look, they're completely entitled to do that. I mean, the question is who will be the bargaining agents in which sectors. So we've made our statement about the fact that we think that they're unlawful as well. That's with the ILO, the International Labour Organisation. What is that about? That's actually about the New Zealand government being held to account for if they put fair pay agreements or compulsory national pay schemes in place, being held to account for breaching their international obligations, which is that they would support voluntary bargaining. This is compulsion.
All right, the wage pressures, you mentioned it before. Just how bad are those wage pressures?
Pretty significant because of labour and skill shortages. It's going to be, I mean, if you look at the volume of apprentices that are coming through the construction trades, if you like, pretty significant, which is fantastic. But almost every region, except in certain sectors, has significant skill shortages, and for some organisations and businesses in the hard hit sectors like tourism, they're still struggling to get people because typically they would be relying on often working holiday makers, and they're simply not in New Zealand anymore.
It's interesting, I spoke to someone, a kiwi fruit owner, and they're paying up to $30 an hour for pickers.
Yeah.
So when you've got that sort of pressure going on, then how do businesses afford it, apart from putting their prices up? Because the absorption rate must be fairly low now.
Yeah, I mean, if you've only, well, both in a domestic market sense and in a international market sense, there's going to be a price cap somewhere, right? And that's the consumer's desire to pay that price. I think New Zealand horticulture attracts a real premium in offshore markets. But there's only so long that you can sustain those high labour prices before you start to look to what you would substitute that labour with and how you can automate to do it. And I know that in that particular sector they've been automating pack houses, for example, but the challenge is in the picking area. It's quite hard to use robotic picking. The technologies are about 5 to 10 years away, but nevertheless that's what will happen is labour will become substituted by automation.
All right, other issues that we need to focus on next year. Now, I'll start. You mentioned education, but that's not so much education from overseas. That's educating our people, our young people.
Yeah, I mean, ROVE is a really big component of that, the review of vocational education. That really needs to land in the next couple of years. Make sure that employers stay connected to the education system. That's one of the core ways that they'll fill some of those labour shortages and skill shortages rather than labour shortages that they're all facing. That will need to bed down. It's an important change to recognise the role that workplace-based training plays in training people, not just young people, but people right across the spectrum. So that remains really, really critical, particularly with the inability with the border shut of businesses to be able to bring in particularly skilled workers.
Well, let's talk about the border. Once it sort of has some form of normality, then the immigration settings, what needs to happen there?
Well, the government announced a reset, I must have been the middle of this year or earlier than the middle of this year. There hasn't really been any advance in that work, and I mean, we will be saying and have said strongly to them that they need to consider the fact that if the education system cannot produce the skills, we're going to have to make the immigration settings flexible and adaptive enough to enable people to get the skills into the country. That's, of course, if the border can be opened.
The construction sector, affordable housing, it all falls into their supply chain. What can we do about any of that? I mean, there's obviously a government review underway, but we all know what the issues are.
Yeah, I mean, I think the really key challenge, I mean, you've seen the government respond with the ability to, build infill housing at a kind of greater level in certain areas through national legislation. That will start to make a difference. There's little to be done about supply chain issues when the northern part of the world or anywhere north of New Zealand is soaking up a lot of the global shipping. So that will remain a challenge until tourists come back here. The government will have to continue to subsidise freight, so that's just going to increase cost and so on. So if you then layer labour shortages, and thankfully it doesn't look like we have, because we've got a big swathe of apprentices sitting in the pipeline, which would be great so long as they don't go to Australia if the border opens.
All right, is there any sort of bright spot that you can see for 2023?
Look, I mean, our exports, particularly in the agricultural sector, still continue to perform really well. They're, in our horticulture exports, they're premium products in those offshore markets. They're big markets, those things are really critical. They're kind of what's part of holding up the that macroeconomic picture at the moment. So they are a bright spot. The challenge for them is going to be people and labour and that shipping.
Right, and I mentioned 2023, and of course it was probably appropriate I mentioned 2023 because 2022 is not looking that good, is it? No, look, we'll be fine. Look, I just want to end. Do you have any message after a pretty tough year for your members?
Yeah, I mean, what we've tried to do is support them as much as we can to get the best information to them to help them manage in what are incredibly uncertain times. And that's required our team to stay close to government and government decision making and try and influence that to assist businesses to be the best that they can be in the circumstances. And hopefully that's reflected in there's a lot of frustration out there. I know it's extremely difficult to operate in what is it's kind of an awkward cyclical effect of variants of COVID. But we're pretty committed to our membership base, and they've been fantastic in terms of their feedback, and we're just looking forward to continue to help them.
All right, well, I know that you've been very, very busy, as has your team this year, and I appreciate the opportunities we've had to speak to you. So hopefully we'll do it all again in 2022.
Well, thank you, Grant, as well, for all your words of wisdom.
We'll catch you soon.